So while we're waiting for everyone to join us, I'd encourage you to take a look at the large arch there that's mainly blue, and maybe just observe it. Tell me what you see in that image. What strikes you? And Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. What else? Can you identify what the scene is? Well, related. So do we have everyone here now? So this arch here, so this church was dedicated to the Holy Trinity. So the Holy Trinity, and then it later merged with another Greek Orthodox parish that was named the Holy Cross. So that's how we get our name. But this church is dedicated to the Holy Trinity. And the most common way that we reflect that in the Orthodox tradition through the use of icons is by depicting the hospitality of Abraham. The hospitality of Abraham. So we're going back to the beginning with Abraham in Genesis. And we have this scene in Genesis where Abraham, who's this righteous man, and his wife, so this is Abraham with his wife Sarah, and they're visited by three angelic visitors. And now remember, this is a Middle Eastern culture where hospitality is important because it could literally mean life and death. If you're in a very inhospitable environment like the desert, where there's little water, and therefore, as humans, we can't drink the water, nor can food grow. So when visitors would pass through these regions, it was very important that hospitality be offered. So these three strangers appear to Abraham and Sarah in the desert, and they provide them with hospitality, the best of everything. And these three angelic visitors, maybe you've heard, it's a quote from Hebrews, but maybe you've heard this quote, that sometimes we entertain angels unawares. Entertaining angels, you ever hear that phrase? So this comes from Hebrews, which is a reflection on this event in Genesis, that Abraham and Sarah were entertaining or giving hospitality to angels unaware. They thought they were simply three visitors, but it turns out they were three angels. The Orthodox interpretation is that these three angels represented the Holy Trinity. They were kind of a foreshadowing of the Holy Trinity, the three persons of the Godhead. So that is that scene, but it's very interesting that, so as soon as you walk into the church, like someone observed, immediately we have food. Food is depicted. And as far back as Abraham, and so today we talk about the three Abrahamic religions, the three religions of the book, which start with Abraham. And all three of these religions, modern Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all trace themselves back to Abraham. So this is, especially for the Western world, a really foundational event. So, and if we look at the ancient world, I remember one time my father really wanted to go to Petra in Jordan. Have you heard of this? One of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. And so we went there to Jordan, and we saw many Christian sites, and also went to Petra, which it's incredible. So it's in this kind of crack in between these two mountains. It's like a hidden city all carved out of this soft rock. And it's incredibly well preserved. This was from the Nabateans, so around the time of Christ and before. And you go in there, and there's well-preserved temples and banquet halls carved into the rock. Now, why would they have all these formal banquet halls? It's because the Nabateans, like most ancient peoples, the center of their, what we would call religious world, was involved eating with the gods, right? Eating with the gods. And almost all pagan religions, kind of this foundational element was eating with the gods. Sacrificing animals was a way to eat with the gods. A lot of people misunderstand the sacrifices, for example, in the Old Testament, the animal sacrifices. The killing of the animal was really secondary. It was just something that had to be done. The sacrifice was that you offered this to God and you shared this meat, this food, and you shared it with your family and your friends and with the God. So in the pagan religions, especially, they would share the animal with the gods by offering a portion of the animal to the god. And usually in the pagan world, they would offer the worst parts of the animal, meaning the parts no one wanted to eat. They would burn it for the gods. Now, in the Old Testament, this was the environment in which Israel was born. This was the mentality of the ancient peoples. So in the Old Testament, God is very specific. He will not accept that. He wants the best offerings. He only accepts the best offerings. So the priest is supposed to give the choice parts of the meat to God. It's burnt, and then the smell of this burnt meat is pleasing to the Lord, it says in the Old Testament. So you see all these connections right from the very foundations of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, this connection with eating. So there's something in the human psyche, I would argue, that sees eating as something more than mere survival. Right? It's always been seen by humans cross-culturally, across time, as something that is at least potentially sacred. Eating is something potentially sacred. And so this is, of course, very true in Christianity, in our Orthodox faith. The very center of our faith involves the same mentality of eating this banquet with our God. Eating a banquet with our God. And then someone mentioned the Last Supper. That's what we look forward to at the end of time. There's this image projected to us Christians that the hope we have is that we will have this banquet with God at the end of time. And we experience it here and now every week on Sunday with having this kind of banquet or meal with our God, Jesus Christ, on the Sunday service. And of course, it involves food. The people offer bread and wine. We offer it to God, He blesses it, and then we offer it back to the people so that they share this meal with God. And this is kind of seen as the main way that we interact with God, that we participate in His life. So again, the eating is an integral part of our faith. And so I think the point I want to make about the Orthodox approach to food is that it is first and foremost seen as something sacred or potentially sacred. And I think that's hard for us to understand in the modern West since the Enlightenment. Now here I get a little theological or philosophical with you, and I know it's Monday morning, but I promise to keep it brief and to unpack it. So I would say two things. One point theologically is that as Christians, we are a revealed religion. In other words, we only know what God reveals to us. And the kind of the fullness of this revelation was when He revealed Himself to us in Jesus Christ, that God became man, He took on human flesh. And this means that He took on human flesh not in a kind of abstract way, but in a specific place, Palestine, in a specific time, which had specific customs, specific language, specific food, cuisine. So all of these things, when Christ was incarnated, He took on all of these human elements and He potentially sanctified them. And this is kind of the key word that I want to point out, is that the Orthodox or ancient Christian faith is holistic. It's holistic. So in the modern West, we tend to make a lot of we compartmentalize our life, and religion becomes simply one compartment. But what I want to argue is that is a kind of foreign modern way of thinking, and that really we should have a more integrated approach to life, where food is, of course, somehow involved with our faith. It's an expression of our faith. It's a practice of our faith. So, kind of the more philosophical point is this: in order for us to really appreciate what ancient peoples thought until maybe about 1700 or so, we have to understand one event And a lot of people, this was really a turning point, but a lot of people don't know what it is. And this was in 1648. You had the Treaty of Westphalia. In 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia. Why is that important? Because with the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, approximately the early 1517 or so, when Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses, with the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, which leads into the Enlightenment, it led immediately in Western Europe, so in what was then the Catholic Church in Western Europe, not the eastern part of the church, the Orthodox Church. You had the Protestants breaking from the Roman Catholics in the West. This led to 100 years of war in Europe, over 100 years of war actually in Europe. And at least the pretext for these devastating wars throughout Europe was this fight between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. So finally, in 1648 in Germany, in Westphalia, a treaty was made in which all the parties in Western Europe basically agreed, look, we're not going to fight anymore about Catholic versus Protestantism. And this is the introduction of secularism. Now, secularism isn't necessarily a negative word. It's a neutral term, really. Secularism is talking about this process in which we demythologize or remove the sacred from public culture, right? From the public sphere. So basically in Europe, they became so wary of the potential for war that they said, look, we're going to remove any reference in the public sphere, any public expression of faith, we're going to remove, because that is a potential for conflict, right? This was a new way of thinking. And so you have this process of secularism that begins to say, okay, public expressions of faith lead to conflict, but we still encourage private understandings of faith. And this is, we're the inheritors of this philosophy here in America in particular. We have, along with France, these very kind of secular models of government. And yet America is one of the most religious places in the world. But officially, publicly, we don't express it. Now, what I'm trying to get at is this is a foreign way of thinking until the 1600s. There was no kind of distinction between public life and private life, public religion versus private religion. The idea that there even was a private religion was kind of inconceivable. So when you have the incarnation, Christ assumes all of these human elements of culture, of public life, and he sanctifies them. And over the centuries, over 1,600 years, Christians, both West and East, sanctified the material creation. Now, what do I mean? Meaning we set apart certain things and made them sacred. So, for example, we set apart certain places and we made them sacred. The church, for example, is a sacred place, whereas outside you would say it's the mundane. We set apart certain people. Clergy means selected, elect. So God selected or elected a certain part of the people to be clergy, set them apart, gave them a sacred function. Set apart place, set apart time. You have a rhythm of feasts and fasting. Feasts and fasting. So all these elements of culture, time, space, persons, all of them were sanctified. There were certain sacred elements. But when you get to the secularism of the 1700s, all of these become potentially dangerous. So you don't typically see priests wearing uniforms like this anymore. Why? Because it's a public expression of faith. Now for us as Christians, as Orthodox Christians, we see all this as natural, that a faith that is separated from its public expression is no kind of faith at all. It's almost inconceivable for us to think in terms of, well, this is the religious part of my life and this is the rest of my life, right? For Greek Orthodox, it's all together, and it's by its very design of Christ as becoming incarnate. We would say that Christ is constantly becoming incarnate. In every place and time, he's becoming incarnate again and again and again and taking on the characteristics and the culture of that particular time and place. So we could even speak about here in Birmingham, out of this church, we have an Orthodox culture that is manifest here in Birmingham in this time, in this place. So the church as the body of Christ assumes these human cultural elements and sanctifies them. Now, so you have that going on for 1,600 years, and there develops a rich tradition of symbol. But then with the beginning of secularism, all these begin to be stripped away. So if we look at our society today, America, which is a secular / Protestant-based culture, we don't have feast days and fast days anymore in most of Christianity and the West. That has been stripped away. So time is really no longer sacred. Even if you look at the weekly cycle, where even 50 years ago, Sunday, everybody knew, was a sacred day. Everyone went to church. But if you look today, that is quickly fading. And it's this process of secularism, of stripping out any meaning. Many people, in fact here, many people will go to church, I know, to a non-denominational church on Tuesday night or Wednesday night and not go on Sunday, right? So time has become desacralized. Persons have become desacralized. So pastors typically don't wear anything different. They aren't considered to have any kind of special function. So all spaces have become desacralized. So Christians will meet in a warehouse or something like that. What I'm suggesting is that secularism and the Enlightenment gave us tools to look at reality in a new way. Science is a method that is an effective method to measure reality. The problem is that it's introduced a kind of fragmentation in our mind, that we've compartmentalized all these areas of life. And I can choose to participate in this one with this group of people, but over in this area, I participate with these other people who have a slightly different culture, and we're constantly selecting pieces of our identity, if that makes sense. But in the Greek Orthodox culture, it's holistic, right? There's one way of doing things that everyone does, and the important thing is that the community does these things together. There's shared kind of understanding of the great kind of arc of life. What's the meaning of life? So you have these patterns in the Orthodox Church, and the main one I want to focus on is the feasting and the fasting. So this was a normal way that many religions have feasting and fasting. Islam has Ramadan. The Jewish tradition has Yom Kippur. In the Orthodox tradition, we have kept the ancient Christian fast, which the Catholic Church also used to have, but over the centuries they've removed the fast. But for the Orthodox Church, we actually fast over 6 months of the year. We fast over 6 months of the year. Now, what do we mean when we say fasting? Fasting means we abstain from animal products, basically. So basically, we're vegan for over 6 months of the year as we prepare for various feasts. So you have a period of preparation and fasting, and then you have a period of feasting, right? So this, and again, this has to do with food, but it's not really even about the food. It's about this whole way of life that involves every aspect of our being. Eating is not something that's profane and secular for us. It's religious. Everything for us is religious, right? It's because it's a part of human life. So we even say that Orthodox Christianity is not a religion, it's a way of life. So it's this holistic way of life that you have with the fasting and the feasting. I would suggest that we've lost this as well too in our modern culture. We don't have these kind of patterns of life, of feasting and fasting that give meaning to time. So that is one of the elements of our Orthodox culture. So let me talk a little bit about feasting. So, and we just had our festival about a week ago. So in the Greek Orthodox mind, there are many churches in Greece. I'll just talk about Greece, for example, but this is true here in America with the Orthodox churches or anywhere in the world. And I should add that, the Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, we're the third largest religion in the world, third largest religious body. You have the Roman Catholics, you have Sunni Islam, and then third is Eastern Orthodox Christianity. It's about 300 million people across the globe, although here in America, it's very, very small. So the way we kind of organize ourselves is there is a monthly cycle. Every month has its feasts and its fasts. And on the feast day, so for example, our church is dedicated, as I said, to the Holy Trinity, which celebrates its feast day on Pentecost. So typically, a church in Greece, traditionally, if they were dedicated to the Holy Trinity on the day of Pentecost, everyone would gather together in the church the night before, which is when the services begin for the next day. They would stay for the services the next morning, and then there would be a great feast after the service was over. And this was called the panegyri, which means literally everything around, which means, how did they envision this? What did they call it that? Because it means that everything happened around the church. Everything happened around the church on the feast day. It sprang from the church with the liturgical, religious, quote unquote, celebration, and then it flowed out into the world to all around the church. You would have dancing, you would have cooking, you'd have roasting lamb, you'd have meal preparation, you'd have dancing, I mentioned, music, etc., which were all connected with and expressions of the faith that they had just lived inside the church. Does that make sense? So they had fasted and prepared themselves for this feast. Then they celebrated the feast, quote unquote, religiously, but that couldn't help but spill over into life outside the church. So that faith and the joy they have from celebrating the feast is then expressed in dance and music and food, right? And so there's a feast. Now, I served in a small village in Greece from 2012 to 2016, and there they still held many of the kind of older traditions. Electricity didn't even come to the village until the 1950s. And there, what did people do? Before television, what did people do for entertainment? They went to the church. They went to the services of the church. So they would look forward to these various feast days. And especially in Greece, we would have lots of chapels out in the countryside, small churches. And each one of those would be dedicated to a feast. So let's say St. Demetrios, which is actually, the feast day is actually tomorrow. So we say we had a chapel out in the country to St. Demetrios. Everyone would go to that church on the feast day of St. Demetrios. So tonight, they would go there for the evening service. They would actually, if it was during the summer, which was the most popular time and the weather was good, they would actually camp outside the church in the field around it. They would wake up the next morning. They would go to church. They had been fasting. They went to church. They received communion. And then they came out, and all that whole kind of field in the country around the church would just explode with food and dancing, etc., music. But again, it's connected with their faith, right? There's no line you can draw between their faith inside the church and the expression of it outside the church. It's a one unit, right? And I think that's what's hardest for us to understand coming from the modern West, is we've gotten used to separating all these elements so that we can pick and choose which ones we do with which people. Whereas in the village, everyone is constantly together all the time. Everything is a community event. So fasting together and feasting together is an expression of communal solidarity, right? So it helps us have communion with each other and with God. So let's see, yeah. So I'm trying to wrap up now. Does anyone have any questions? I could say something, please think if you have a question, but I wanted to mention, now I remember, in the monasteries. So in the Orthodox Church, we have a strong monastic tradition. And in the monasteries, what they do is and if you've seen pictures of the old monasteries in Greece, they were like walled cities. So you had these four walls to protect them. Inside the monastery, of course, in the center of these four walls was the church. And then along the four walls were buildings that contained the rooms where the monks stayed. Always in the center from the church always faces this way east. And if you would go out the door here, in a monastery, always they would have a building opposite, right? So I would walk out this door, there would be a small walkway, and then there would be another building, which was the refectory, or the dining hall. And the monks would come together. Sometimes they pray 8 hours a day, various services. So they're always in the church praying, but let's say they have the evening service. called Vespers. When they finish Vespers, the service kind of concludes in a normal way, but everyone maintains in the monastery a sort of silence, as if the service hasn't concluded. And you would file out in a very kind of ritualistic way. There's a certain order. You would file out, you'd go across to the dining hall, the food would be blessed, and you would eat all together while they would read something. They would read some kind of spiritual work, the Bible, something like that. And then they would come back in the evening. After that, they come back and there's a late evening service, a short one. So the meal is kind of packaged, sandwiched in between services, and it's not considered a kind of break, right? It's part of the service. There's this sacred element to eating, which, again, I think we've kind of lost. Someone was telling me recently that in France, that the school children in France actually get like a whole hour for lunch, and they actually have a sit-down meal with like tablecloths and like courses, right? But that is a very, and the Greeks and the French have a close connection, I would say, culturally. But that's really interesting, that they make sure to make the meal something special, right? It's just inconceivable to them. One, to see people like eating while they're like walking down the street or drinking a coffee while they're walking down the street. In Greece and in France, almost unthinkable. But for us, it's normal because eating or drinking coffee it's functional, right? I got work to do. I got to get things done, so I have to do it on the run. But in this ancient mindset, it's unthinkable. No, this is something sacred. It's something special taking place when we eat together. Finally, I'll say this, that I consider myself, I know some of you are culinary professionals. I don't know how to cook anything, to my wife's great frustration, but I feel like every Sunday or every time we have what we call the liturgy, I'm preparing this banquet. That's how we view what we're doing in the Mass or the liturgy. We're preparing this banquet where we're eating with our God, Jesus Christ. And so, on the altar there, this is the kind of dining table. It's an altar, but it's also a dining table where we prepare the food, the bread and the wine. We offer it to God. We prepare it. We break it in a certain way. We distribute it to the people. And it's a banquet in the sense that it's not just food that happens during the Mass or the liturgy, but it's a whole banquet experience, meaning it has music, which banquets typically had, and it has a speech, right? So you have the sermon or the homily, which is meant to be this kind of an elevated type of speech that honors the occasion, right? So I feel like every Sunday I'm preparing this banquet. I'm preparing some kind of sermon or homily to say in order to honor the occasion of the banquet. We're practicing the music. We're making sure that we prepare the bread and the wine, and we have this banquet every week. So anyway, I'm just sharing some thoughts with you. Thank you all for being here. If you have any questions, you can stop me afterwards. And then I think, Santhi, we want to go back now to the banquet hall, and Santhi's going to talk to you probably about more practical stuff than I talk about. So. God bless you. Thank you for your patience with me.